Hi everyone, I'm Adolfo Neto, and today we are going to talk to the authors of the great book, The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, which are Emily Bender, M. Bender, and Alex Hanna. But let me first introduce myself and the colleagues that are going to interview Emily and Alex with me. I'm Adolfo Neto, a professor at the Federal University of Technology, Paraná, Curitiba, where I conduct research in software engineering with a focus on human aspects. And I coordinated the Fronteiras da Engenharia de Software podcast. I hold a PhD in computer science from the University of São Paulo and a bachelor's degree also in computer science from the Federal University of Alagoas. I'm here with Gisele Dalva Seco. She holds a Bachelor of Education and a master's degree in philosophy from the Federal University of Santa Maria. She also holds a PhD in philosophy from PUC-Rio with a thesis on the use of computers in mathematics and was a faculty member at the California State University, San Bernardino, California, USA, until last summer. And she works on topics related to her area of expertise, the history and philosophy of formal sciences, issues on teaching logic in philosophy, and the history of women in logic in the analytic tradition. She's also one of the editors of the Lógicas Brasileiras Brazilian Women Logicians blog page. Thanks for being here, Giselle.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And also to our authors. It's a pleasure to be here with you and meeting you all.
I'm also here with Victor Hugo Germano. He's a tech executive with 25 years of industry experience and co-founder of Lambda 3, which is a company here in Brazil. And he's currently a MSc candidate in artificial intelligence at the University of San Diego and holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the Federal University of Santa Catarina. Thanks for being here too, Victor.
It's awesome to be here, and I'm super excited. I'm a huge listener to the Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, and yeah, let's have this conversation.
Okay, now let me present our guests. Dr. Emily M. Bender is a professor of linguistics at the University of Washington, where she's also the faculty director of the Computational Linguistics Master of Science program and affiliate faculty in the School of Computer Science and Engineering in the Information School. She holds a PhD in linguistics from Stanford University, an MA in linguistics from Stanford too, and an AB in linguistics from the University of California, Berkeley. She has published several papers on the risks of large language models. She's the first author of a relatively famous paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots. Can language models be too big? From 2021. And she's one of the hosts of the Mystery AI Hype Theater podcast. Thanks for having accepted our invitation, Emily.
Thank you so much for organizing this. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks. And last but not least, Dr. Alex Hanna. She's Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute there and a lecturer in the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley. She holds a BS in Computer Science and Mathematics and a BA in Sociology from Purdue University and an MSc and PhD in Sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has published widely in top-tier venues across the social science and also top-tier computer science conference. She's also, of course, one of the hosts of the Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, and which I forgot to mention, it also has a blog. Thanks for having accepted our invitation, Alex.
Thank you for having us. This is so exciting.
Okay, so my big goal here, what I really want people to do after they watch this interview is they buy the book and read the book. So let's first ask a few questions about the book, but Okay, it's a conversation. We have a script here, but we don't have to follow the script perfectly. So, congratulations on the book. Now, my my point, as I told you, I'm a computer science professor. I'm surrounded by people that use AI between quotes because you explain in the book that AI is not a good name for everything. But suppose this person is already using large language models in their daily life, writing emails, drafting texts, generating code. In my specifically in software engineering, lots of people are using LLMs to generate code, create images, and so on. Given that, why should they take the time to read your book? So you can choose who answered the questions.
I'll give it a start, but I'm sure Alex will have things to add. First of all, we're very happy for people to read the book. Buy it, sure, but also look for it at your library. The main thing is reading it. Um, and I would say that it is always a good idea to understand better what's behind the things that we use. And what's behind so-called artificial intelligence is both the marketing and the motives of the companies making it, but also the labor of many, many people, and also a lot of environmental impact. And I think that it is a good practice, especially for something that you might be using very regularly, to have a good sense of what it is, how it works, and in particular, who made it and what its impacts are.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is such an interesting way of approaching it because it's often thinking, well, people approach us and they say, "Well, I'm using it in this way. Is this kind of an okay way of using it?" And we're like, "Well, we're not here to tell you to shame you out of using these things, but is to contextualize what these technologies are and what they do in the world." And so one nice part of this book and writing this book with Emily is that Emily is a linguist and really is helpful in really explicating what it means to interact with synthetic text. And I'm a sociologist, and so I'm often thinking about dimensions of labor and the structures around that, and the kind of AI supply chains and how it gets enmeshed into organizational cultures. So the use of these technologies, it doesn't, these technologies do not emerge magically. They, like Emily said, there's quite a lot of labor, environmental cost to them, these huge data center builds outs. But in addition, they're the ways that these are imposing a type of automation at work that can devalue what humans do and give a veneer that they're actually saving time when they're doing anything. But as well as kind of doing cognitive offloading to machines that are not ready for it and are not designed to ever be ready for that kind of automation. And so it's helpful to couch thinking about these tools as kind of a project, I would say, of labor devaluing and really devaluing of what it means to be human.
And in that aspect, I think the book does a great job to, you read it like a podcast, but I think there was one aspect that I found really attached to, which is the ridicule as practice, especially being working in the professional services industries for so long. I'm used to the hype, and I'm definitely used to companies lying to have other companies buy their products. But one of the things that happen after a while is that you realize and you can see through some of those tactics. And I think that the book does a great job at presenting a lot of that in a way that's not overly academic. It's not overly philosophical, which is also great. But definitely, because there's such a huge crowd being dragged into artificial intelligence, it's important to have more conversations that feel more connected to the day-to-day life. So that's a great point. And well, the ridiculous practices might be the best practice that I took from the book, and I continue to use it as I'm studying this.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate hearing that. The intention of the book was to present these things to an audience that was, you know, was paying attention to the field, but were in no ways any kind of experts. And so we often get told, especially from people in the field of AI, that, well, you can't critique this because you don't really understand the technology, and that certainly doesn't need to be the case. I mean, people see these impacts in their communities for in many different levels. There are many different fights happening right now around data centers, for instance, and there have been some victories around data centers being constructed in places like Tucson and places like Ypsilanti, Michigan, and really all over the world. And many of these places, including Tucson and Ypsilanti, have fought back and said we don't want these data centers here, and have really delayed their construction because they're very taxing on the electrical system and taxing on the water systems, and also output carbon and air pollution. And so that's at the point of production. At the point of deployment, there's many other types of harms, and we could go on and on about those as we do in the book. And so it's very important for us to really make this accessible to a wide range of people. And I'm really thankful that you think that ridicule as praxis is something very helpful to to grab onto. As you know, from a podcast listener, that's something that we've deployed quite a bit in our practice.
Yeah, I just want to add that the ridicule, I think, is effective on two levels. On the one hand, it's a tool to undercut the ridiculous claims, and the people selling the hype really present themselves as sort of, you know, all, very, very knowledgeable, very concerned with what's best for the entire world, and in a position to know what's best for the entire world. And I think that ridicule can be a very effective way to undercut that. But it is also a way for us to keep spirits up in the face of really dark things. And the preface to the book starts off describing it as coming out of a joyful collaboration between a linguist and a sociologist. And my mom was one of our early readers. And she looked at that, she saw the preface after she'd read everything else, and she said, "What do you mean joyful? This is all terrible stuff. How can you?" And I was like, well, what was joyful was working with Alex on this. And part of that joy actually comes from the um, the way that we find humor in things. The other thing that I want to say in the context of your question and remarks is that this is written to be very accessible, but it was also very important to us as scholars to cite our sources. And so they're a little bit subtle because they're not called out in the hard copy. If you have the ebook, you see the little numbers, but the hard copy doesn't show you where there's an end note, but something like the last 60 pages of the book are actually end notes, which are mostly sources for the various claims in the book. And then there's a few other things in there where there was something that we felt didn't quite fit in the main narrative, but we also couldn't let go of. So if you're all done with the book and you want a little bit more, sift through the end notes for those meaty further discussions.
And circling back to one of the comments that Dr. Hanna just said, we are right at the moment in Brazil where there has been a decision to build two main data centers, one in the far north of Brazil and one in the south of Brazil, in specifically rural areas that are affected with drought. So this whole conversation, it's not it's kind of hard to actually pinpoint all of the points for those contracts, especially because it happened in the same similar way as in different countries. So a group from the Brazilian government went to Silicon Valley to talk to big tech and to um, expected to have an investment of orders of magnitude of a few $100 billion in throughout the next 10 years. And that was the trigger to the Brazilian government to decide that they would just give the land out, allow for that construction to happen, and continue to that conversation that would generate um, more work. There will be a lot of employees and during the construction, but we know that that's definitely not the case. So and it is happening right now as we are discussing if this is feasible from a legislative perspective, and if this is actually viable when we look into the numbers, right? So I think the number is like $300 billion in the next 10 years, and that is just so absurd that it is not even possible for such a thing to happen in Brazil in 10 years, given that each data center would take like 2 3 years to be built. So it's interesting that everything is happening in the same time that this book came out, and we are discussing about it.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about it is that these data centers are not being constructed in places that are abundant in water resources. They're being constructed in places which have pretty lax regulatory regimes and they won't have popular pushback. And so you could imagine that these would be constructed maybe in some places that had access to a lot of fresh water, which is dwindling more and more due to the effects of climate change. But they're being constructed in places in the U.S. like Maricopa County, which is in the middle of the Arizona desert, or like Southern California, or places of that nature. I mean, there are even places that have abundant fresh water, and there's a lot of community pushback, like in places like on the shores of Lake Michigan and Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of these. It's kind of counterintuitive that there's going to be this building, and I think you're spot on, Victor, in suggesting that many of these promises around jobs and revenue generation are really just they're kind of outlandish on the face of them. These jobs in terms of construction may build add something like seeing one union brag to suggest it would have 2,000 extra jobs in the construction period. But then even if that was true, that's 1 or 2 years. And then after, a data center is not going to have that many jobs that come after it. At the same time, the water intake and the kind of environmental impacts are going to be much more long lasting than that very short burst of jobs that are brought to the area.
Yeah, and if I may add something, I think there's something in the case of Brazil, especially the one data center in the northeastern of Brazil, that I've heard that the official justification for it, of course, it goes through the points that Victor already mentioned, but also that right now, because sovereignty is such a big topic with respect to the Brazilian legislation on AI and on big tech and everything. So one justification that I've heard from the Minister of Economy was that, well, we need to do that right now because then we will guarantee our sovereignty, because we need our data centers. And so like we have this another layer of, I would say, it's almost perverse to say that, to
Hmm.
play the card of sovereignty to then justify the building of these data centers. But at the same time, I think this shows another layer of the discussion uh, with respect to the inevitability discourse, right? So
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
going to happen anyway. So it's better for us to build it now and then it's ours because then so it's just it's very tricky, right?
It
To
is very tricky. And
especially adding this
I
aspect.
want to check if I've understood this correctly. So the idea is that under the flag of sovereignty, there is an argument to accept a data center that belongs to a foreign multinational uh, company, and in fact, to give them land and rights to water in order to run
So
this
we
data
will
center.
be mostly a landlord of a building that runs on computers from a big tech.
Okay, so
So
the
there's no sovereignty apart from the fact that it's in a city in Brazil
yeah, that's
that can be
really
seen.
really sad. Yeah. So
Yeah, so
yeah, frustrating. So I want to recommend another book, which is Karen Howe's Empire of AI, which is an absolutely wonderful book. And there's sections in there where she follows the work of activists in Chile and Uruguay, um, pushing back successfully against the imposition of data centers. And there was another recent success story in Tucson, Arizona. There was going to be an Amazon affiliated data center in the desert. Okay, Tucson's in the desert, and the company that was coming in to offer this was making claims that they were going to somehow be a net positive influence on the water supply in the desert. Like it's not clear where this water is. Yeah. So I think that the message is, and this comes back around to your point, Gisele, about inevitability, is that we should give no benefit to the doubt to the people who are coming in and saying that they are going to create these data centers. We know that they have enormous impacts on water and electrical grids and follow on impacts in terms of what it takes to power those electrical grids. And so, if they are making promises that seem too good to be true, really pin them down on that, make them show like how that could possibly be true. And if they come in and say, well, you know, this is the way of the future, so it's got to be somewhere, it may as well be here so that you get, you know, the 2000 construction jobs or whatever it is. um, I think it's absolutely worth recognizing that, as you do, as part of the discourse of inevitability, with this idea that this is what is going to happen, because the future is not written. And anytime we sort of say, well, we've just got to deal with it, it's how it is, we are basically giving in to big tech's demands for us to give up our agency.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I can just hop in to say that Adolfo interviewed someone, Renata Gomes, right, about the empire of AI the other day. So we already had this this partially, at least, a discussion of this
Excellent.
book. But so perhaps now it's a good moment for me to make my question about the inevitability and focus a little bit on the sixth chapter of the book, in which you make the distinctions between the presented dichotomy between the doomers and the boosters, especially because we know that the main boosters nowadays are in the in the educational sector, right? So if you could talk a little bit more about uh, how you build your argument uh, surrounding the idea that the boomers, no, the doomers and the boosters are two sides of the same coin, is the metaphor you use. But I was thinking this morning that perhaps a good metaphor, a better metaphor, would be the idea of like they're the two poles of the same world, because then you have all the, you know, the space in between. So if you could say a little bit more about this distinction,
Yeah,
and how so important to me, like how you build the argument around this idea that they share so many things, that when
exactly.
we look at the dichotomy at the face value, we think, oh no, it's just two distinct positions, but they share, so the framework is the same. So if you could say a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. And this is why we specifically go for two sides of the same coin rather than two poles of the same world, because we want to make the case that there is not very much space in between. So
Oh, I
the
see.
boosters and the doomers themselves um, present their positions as opposite ends of a scale,
I
and
see.
furthermore make that scale all encompassing. That basically, in their worldview, the range of possible positions are this is going to solve all our problems or it's going to kill us all, and then there's some possible positions in the middle. And we like to point out that actually those two are two sides of the same coin, because you've got the boosters saying AI is a thing, it's inevitable, it's imminent, and it's going to solve all of our problems. And the doomers are saying AI is a thing, it's inevitable, it's imminent, and it's going to kill us all. They have so many of the same assumptions, and then they just take a different turn at the end. And it is these assumptions, like this AI is a thing, what I've wrapped up in there is everything about, well, the synthetic text extruding machines, the things that are built to mimic the way people use language, in the doomer booster imagination are doing far more than that. They're reasoning, they're learning, they're on the verge of combusting into consciousness. And all of that is fake and it's science fiction, and we have a lot of fun ridiculing it. Not to say that science fiction is necessarily ridiculous. Science fiction can be great, but as people who are writing bad science fiction and pretending it's science and serious policy discussion deserve ridicule. So they've got this worldview that is not based in reality, that's shared between the two of them, and yet somehow gets out into the media as just the basic frame that everyone has to play with. And so by calling these two sides of the same coin, we're basically trying to draw people's attention to all of the space outside of that frame.
Okay.
And we should say that this has really taken a very strong foothold in policy discussions in the U.S. And so in the book, we start off with this anecdote about this hearing in then Majority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer's insight forums that he had, and he asked, what is your probability of doom versus your probability of hope? And then you have these two axes, and I guess they're I don't know if probability. I don't think probability hope is one minus p doom, but I think they maybe go independently. But there's some strong collinearity of them, um, and so there's kind of this notion of that has hold, and there's kind of a we don't know what people's reported in that because there's no transcript of that hearing. Um, you'd imagine people towards it tends toward the middle or whatever, or there's some people on the who are very doomster and very 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 hopeful. But then it also is mirrored in some this document that has been going around, which is called AI 2027, which was written by a few people from this particular group called the Rationalists, who have a few different places of debate on the internet, such as the Less Wrong forums, and they have a few different people that they hold in high regard in this space. But many of them, there's so many different assumptions that are being made that um, within that document, but it is pervasive through many of these discussions. Many of them, and we talk about this a bit when we pick apart the piece on our podcast, but we talk a little bit about some of the presumptions being made around how science happens and how discovery happens and how any kind of quote unquote progress within these domains actually happens. And there's so much suspension of judgment that one needs to make to take this seriously at all. And yet, because it has this vision that veers either into boosterism or doomerism with only like a small intervention, it shows that the path is pretty much the same. And I think that's a good illustration that shows a particular sort of path dependency. But that path dependency is also based on very, very um, problematic and poorly constructed premises.
So I would have a follow up question on this that I would ask later, but now it seems like it's the right occasion, which is then to think about the role of history in knowing better what's going on. Because when we look at the history of scientific discovery or the history of technology, and more especially the history of computer science, right? It's not the first hype that we have. I myself wrote a PhD dissertation on the use of computers in mathematics, and then in the 70s, the four color theorem proof was like, oh my God, now everything is going to change in mathematics because we have computers. So people were talking about the computer revolution in mathematics. So when you go there and you see it in that occasion, things that were being said about like the hype of computers at that time in which we didn't even have personal computers, but in any case. So I was thinking about like the role of history in the literacy that we need to build around these topics, and then not only the philosophy of it, because we need to understand a little bit of like the history and philosophy of science at all, but specifically in the history of computer science. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about the role of history in building the literacy that we need in order for people to understand what's going on contextually, but then also perhaps this would be a step towards understanding better the black box situation or the opacity behind both positions, the doomers and the boosters, because it seems to me that the problem of opacity or the black box aspect of it, it's a key element on it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to the history of it, I mean, in this book, and something that I thought was helpful at different points was to always historicize the
Yes.
old trick to ensure that you're putting the technology within the context, and to know that the kind of way that quote unquote this is going to change everything ignores how prior disruptive elements to change everything didn't really change everything. They're kind of reiterations and reinscriptions of existing processes. And those processes are social, political, and economic. And so, one thing in terms of the history of the hype, we talk about this in the book about the field's foundings and the way that the original discussions around thinking machines in the Dartmouth Convention in 1956, in which the artificial intelligence term is coined by John McCarthy as a bid to distinguish this group of other researchers from this neighboring field in cybernetics. Which still has to do with many similar things, including control and automation, and the kind of making of mechanical what are organic type of mental processes. And so that historicizing is also helpful in things thinking about the history of automation. I mean, there's a book that one of my colleagues, um, Sophie Song, has been reading, and we've been discussing. It's called Labor's End: The Promise of Automation. The Promise of Automation Degraded Work. I think it's sorry. How the Promise of Automation Degraded Work. I'm sorry, by Jason Reshikoff. And so in this, we see so many of the similar types of discussions of automation with large language models. We're not going to have teachers, or we're going to have doctors, or whatever. And this is really coming to fruition with regards to the factory line and the assembly line, especially in car manufacturing or whatnot, and heavy manufacturing. But so much of this discussion, that workers are we're not going to have a need for workers. We're going to have this period of massive productivity, that we're just that this is inevitable, that we need this kind of limitless growth, and labor shouldn't get in the way in this. We're just going to innovate. um, read this book, and the same language would be applicable today. So the introduction of these technologies in these different domains, these are almost cyclical. This is when there's some kind of new technological innovation that is promising some kind of massive automation. I mean, and we're not going to lead to this, what Mark Andreessen has called the consumer cornucopia, this kind of limitless, the kind of futuristic world where consumer prices go to zero. That's of course not what's going to happen. It's instead going to bring this era of, this devaluing of labor, and this way of really depressing wages.
Uh, uh, Most of us here are professors, and we know that many students are using ChatGPT and so on, those products, and also that we know that some colleagues, and there was, I'm not sure if you have seen a paper by Olivia Guest and several co-authors, but some colleagues think, oh, we can do it, we can do anything. We have to accept the students are going to use it in education, so we have to use it too, and we have to teach students how to use AI better ethically. What do you think about that?
So we've been having a lot of discussions in our group chats about this idea that there's a somehow more ethical way to use these things, and that again, this inevitability narrative, it's here to stay. So we have to do harm reduction and somehow and I think there was somebody in some of this discourse online who said, yes, the way to reduce the harm of these things is to use them less. Right? The harm reduction is less use. That being said, I don't think it's effective to try to ban use in an educational context, because that then sets up professors and teachers as policing what the students are doing, rather than the collaborative relationship we want in the classroom. So I think what we need is, following, for example, what Olivia Guest and her co-authors say, is absolutely not buying into it at the institutional level. We don't want to be encouraging its use. And then in the sort of person-to-person, teacher-to-student level, come at it with we are here to help you learn. And everyone from their own disciplinary perspective, I think, can make the case as to why these systems do not support learning, and what it is that students miss out on when they turn to them. And for me, it's usually in the case of writing something. So if I have a student who has an essay that they're writing for me, the first point I make to them is, I'm not assigning essays because I need essays to grade. That's not the purpose of this exercise, right? But also, the purpose is not for you to turn in the most polished sort of standard possible essay. The purpose really is for the learning that happens when the student writes the essay. And if the student gives me something they didn't write, then the work that I do giving feedback on that writing that's not theirs is not useful to anybody. And the student has missed out on the chance to work on developing their voice. And I've missed out on the chance to really hear from the student. And so this is the approach that I take. And it starts from accepting that we can't expect to fully eradicate things, and that the attempt to do so puts us into this policing frame that is unhelpful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not teaching right now, and I still think it's helpful to think about what it would necessarily take. And I think, like I don't really have a great answer just because teaching in different fields is going to be a bit different in every different field. And I don't think the point is necessarily even to necessarily talk about the use of these technologies on their own merits or the quality of them, because I actually kind of think that's not the point. To say that the outputs are bad, from the perspective of being bad output, well, that's not why as Emily suggested, that's not why we write, or that's not why we do this. The question's about process, and it's also to talk about why these technologies are in themselves encapsulations of political projects that are meant to devalue a lot of critical thinking and devalue the way in which we develop our own acumen in our own fields and in our own processes of research. And so, yeah, you could have students use them and compare the outputs and go, man, wasn't that a waste of time to read the output and to check everything was right? Or you could say, this thing took, in your prompting, took, a couple 100 gallons of water and, took energy here and took a bunch of labor, and you know this $1.5 billion suit that settlement that Anthropic settled is only going to give artists $3,000 for work that took them years to make. I mean, and say, do you want to be part of that kind of centralizing project? And I think that is a much more of an effective intervention, to be done in this. So I think, because I kind of think that discussion around you're going to use this and comparing the trash and the outputs kind of misses the boat. But then developing tools that are very disciplinary specific and that kind of development of consciousness, I think, is the more important project here.
Yeah, which again is interesting to think that making a comparison between what's happening in the U.S., especially in California, where the Cal State system is just totally taken now by the big tech. So I've witnessed this like the last semester that I taught there, right? So just out of a sudden, we just had this letter from the president of the university saying, "Hey guys, you know what? Now we have it. ChatGPT is just here," and so we were flooded with a lot of trainings and things, and then just it's here. So it's different also, like the what you call a strategic refusal in the book. It will be different also depending on how your institution is dealing with it, because if we compare this situation, especially the Cal State system situation, with what's going on in Brazil, we're still just, I feel like I'm coming from the future when I come back to Brazil and I say, hey, you know what, I'm going to tell you something. Once it is institutionalized, the strategic refusal needs to be crafted totally differently. So then perhaps collective labor action and other things that you talk about in the book needs to be like the right way to go. We still don't need that in Brazil right now. But so I'm just wondering, making a comparison between situations in which the takeover is real and it's done already, and our situation here in Brazil, in which we still off. And again, because the differences of our university systems, but I think we still have time, or some time to try to organize and build this strategic refusal in a different way, because especially in comparison with what's going on in California right now at the Cal State systems.
I would, first of all, I do not envy Cal State faculty. What you all are going through, that is horrific. And I think that what you're pointing out, really shows how important refusal is in this moment, that we are things are not settled. And so I think every act of refusal is especially impactful now in the ways that it opens up space for more refusal. um, I would say to anybody from Cal State, anyone else from Cal State listening, that I think that organizing is really important. What the Cal State Faculty Union is doing is hugely important. And I think that there is also still scope for individual action. Like if you look at the principles of academic freedom, um, I would interpret them as saying that even Cal State faculty can still say, in my class, this is not going to be used.
Absolutely. Oh,
Right?
yes. Yes. And that's exactly what I did last semester. I said, hey, we're going to do the most revolutionary thing you ever done. Like, you're going to buy a notebook and a pen, and you're going to come here and stay with me for 1 hour each time we have a class. And it's probably the last time you're going to have this one. So, I just, but this is also, I think, I feel like I was privileged because I just had one course to teach. It was a critical thinking course. I could craft my course adequately. I had the time. I could, grade,
Mhm.
old school grading and things like that. But I know that's not the case for most of my colleagues. They're especially the ones who teach like writing intensive courses and things like that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I totally agree that we still, some of us still have like the space to try to craft things and do the strategic refusal in a more individual level. But I want to be hopeful that here in Brazil we still have time to, just to discuss and try to prepare for the tech takeover that is about to come.
Well, I have bad news because a few hours ago there was an event happening in. I think OpenAI is trying to be connected to the Brazilian government, and because those companies they are giving a lot for free, right?
Oh,
So
sure.
we don't know.
We are the
Maybe
product.
yes, they are going to give something to Brazilians, and we don't know what's going to happen after that.
So I want to talk a little bit about what I was just doing last week. I was in Paris for UNESCO's Digital Learning Week, and I got to give a public lecture there, which was a wonderful opportunity. And one of the things that I said in that lecture, there's also a written version, is that anybody who's making decisions, for example, in education systems, should look with great suspicion on the offerings of the tech companies, even when it is ostensibly for free, right? Because what's in it for them? Why are the tech companies giving this tech away for free? Um, it's not out of the goodness of their heart. A tech company does not have a heart, it's a company, right? And so, things that are in it for them, it could be reputation washing, but it could also be, hey, look at this market of people, these students who are going to get hooked on our products, or maybe it's access to the data, or something like that. So I encouraged education decision makers to really see the education systems that they're in charge of not as sites of lack of resources, but actually of sites of great wealth, because the time and attention of students is an extremely valuable thing and not something that we should just be handing over to the big companies because they say they're giving us something for free.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of fast tracking what we did with social media and the kind of ways in which the paths, they're offer this and kind of quote unquote flood the zone with this, this consumer product and then find a way to monetize it somewhat later. So there hasn't been really any kind of way to monetization, any kind of robust monetization and to recoup the huge capital expenditure costs of building these data centers. And so this is one reason it's being often offered in educational context because you get these university contracts or you get K through 12 contracts, and we're kind of following this path not only of social media but also existing educational technology. So tools like Coursera, not Coursera, sorry, uh, Canvas or Google Classroom, and then finding these ways to then have vendor lock-in with these tools. The problem, and this reiterates something Emily said, is that we are at this point of refusal where these we don't have to be locked into any of these. I mean, there's not really value that's being brought. It's more like there's some students using this, but many are not, and so it's not like this critical infrastructure. And it is helpful and it is important to refuse at that point. And so it's going to be interesting, especially in the next year or two, to see as many entities and many organizations start to sour on these tools to show that they aren't making students quote unquote more productive or producing quote unquote new science, um, and to see how they try to prop up the whole edifice, because there's so much expenditure that is being put into building these data centers, and it isn't turning out this massive profit that they hoped it would.
So one of the points that I wanted to bring to the conversation is, so before we discussed about this idea that we should forget to talk about the almighty AI and focus on the problems of right now. And I noticed that in the book, one particular subject maybe was left out, which is AI in the military. So target acquisition, drone killing drones, and the kill chain that usually happens in these situations. And in his book, Phil Jones on the work without the worker, it describes people in conflict areas training AI on the drones that will probably be used to attack the same areas. So how you're seeing that military use of AI in the world now, and how big of a problem that can be.
Yeah, so I mean, it's helpful to discuss what we again here disentangling what we mean by AI and what we mean by what the systems are. So target acquisition, is this combination of computer vision problem of sort of object detection, and then maybe possibly filtering out individuals through network analysis. And I mean, calling this all AI is very difficult because things like target acquisition, these were the earliest kinds of developments in earliest types of technologies involved in computer vision. There's a book by James Dobson called The Birth of Computer Vision, in which he discusses kind of the initial kind of object detection and line recognition systems and the early history of the perceptron by Rosenblatt. And so this kind of these have been technologies that have been used in military innovation for many years. The practice of calling it automation then further obscures and makes opaque what's happening behind, as Giselle said, the black box, and trying to discern whether what's happening in target acquisition or in decision making and command and control systems. And we had an episode of our podcast with the great science and technology scholar Lucy Suchman, in which we were talking about this Palantir demo. Palantir being the military company founded by Peter Thiel, um, and headed by Alex Karp. And the way that they had provided this LLM interface to kind of a command and control structure of troop deployment, and they had a kind of example of doing this in the Ukraine. And so much of this is happening, and so much of what this is doing is it is obfuscating the lines of accountability of target acquisition. And in the book we mentioned this reporting from Yuval Abraham in 972 magazine, in which these tools called this pair of tools called Lavender and the Gospel, which we're discerning and opening up the scope of target acquisition in Gaza and in Israel's latest assaults in Gaza and the Palestinian occupied territories. And so that is one very clear place in which these tools are opening the field, but we see more and more of this happening in different conflict zones and also in surveillance um, all over the world. And so many of these things, as people like Anthony Lobestein have highlighted, they're tested in places like Gaza and the West Bank, and then they're brought to different and exported to different parts of the world.
There is
So
a
just oh, So
let me
one small comment is I think that the idea of having big techs assuming contracts with governments now to apply their main data mining technologies, which is using their data infrastructure as a way to funnel that information to be used in target acquisition, for example, is something that is concerning to say the least, especially when the same kind of technology will also be used to surveillance in some of the states and some of the countries in the world.
let me just read some comments from the live stream. That's Darknet says that computer vision is sick. Here in Brazil, lots of police how do you say police forces, they use it and they arrest people, and usually they say, oh, we arrest that person, that very dangerous criminal, and but they don't tell that sometimes they arrest an innocent man or an innocent woman. And the same person said that for studying I find notebook LM very helpful, and also that code interviews, so he or she is probably a software developer. I have been coding interviews I have been in lately encourage using AI, especially if the employer is on a different stack. AI won't teach you the principles, AI's power, but responsibility remains with us. I believe you mentioned in the book that at some point companies are going to force people to use AI.
We're starting to see some of that already. So since we wrote that, for example, I have, we hear a lot actually out of Amazon about software engineers being basically required to integrate large language models into their coding practice. And this seems to be driven by the idea in higher management that this is going to make things more efficient. But if there was a recent study out of someone called METR that found that actually it didn't make people more efficient. And there's this interesting contradictory result where the people who were using the LLMs felt like they were more efficient, and however they were measuring productivity, they were actually less efficient than the control group. So I think that this is back to the points before about refusal, why it is so important. I have another story, a friend of mine who's a nurse in a general practice, and part of her job involves responding to patient emails over the patient portal. And she was told that she wasn't using that she should be using ChatGPT, and that they have been monitoring her usage and found that she wasn't using it because she wants to actually write authentic responses. And her employer told her that that was not okay, that she should be using it. So there's certainly, this was, I should say that in writing the book, one of the very few points of tension. Alex and I, Alex is a dream co-author, but every once in a while we would come up against something. And Alex is much more confident making predictions about the future than I am. And this is one where she was absolutely right.
There's an interesting comment with that. Is I participated in a group where we would try all the tactics to bypass the AI interview process. So if you wear glasses, if you have books up showing books on the background, and how that would affect the hiring processes, and a lot of that is available online as a way to well, fight against that type of tool.
Yeah, and I just want to speak also to this comment about Notebook LM being helpful. Notebook LM, I understand to be a Google product that is designed to summarize longer texts and give a sort of pedagogical or extrude something in the form of a pedagogical approach to what was in the text. And I think that that is actually quite harmful to the learning process. What comes out sounds authoritative, but in fact, you are giving yourself more work if you would then like to go back through and check that everything you absorbed, I don't quite want to say learn, but everything you absorbed from that summary is actually supported by the main text, because of course the summary that you have just consumed is going to impact how you go and read the underlying texts if you do so at all. And so I think that that is, in the end, if you're going to do it well, going to take much more time than just reading the text to begin with. And you might say, well, why are summaries bad? If it were a summary produced by a person who has some accountability from what's in there, who has a positionality and a point of view that you could know something about, that is a very different artifact than an artificially produced summary that nobody has accountability for.
And then again, you lose what Alex mentioned before, which is the process, right?
Yes,
So what we are giving up when we use these tools is just exactly the capacity to go through the process and actually learn something,
for
right?
sure, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's happening also in research. I'm in a group with a lot of masters and PhD students from other universities, but they are using, just today they are talking about a consensus app. Oh, it's great for doing uh, uh, a review of the literature. I tried it, and how do I know if it's right? How do I know if it really searched for all the relevant literature? I can't unless I do the research myself. So it's
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think we mentioned this in the book, but talking about going through the literature and trying to explore literature trails and learning how to discern what is relevant is, that is part of the research process, and it's part of, as much as there are problems with being disciplined by your discipline, which, I have a lot of words about. There is something to be said for knowing what is relevant to many of the scholars within the discipline to focus on kind of key debates, um, to really identify what things are central. Um, and this is kind of a very kind of computer science type approach. If you are identifying what may be central problems in a particular debate, you're often going to be missing things which have already been discussed in other fields. If I had a nickel for every time physicists rediscovered social network analysis, I'd have at least 10 cents, but it would still be very indicative of how many times these things happen.
Well, apparently we lost our host for a while. Okay. Um, hmm. Do you have any other question, Victor, for them?
I, I have
I
plenty of
know,
questions.
I know you do.
I just wanted to make sure that we are on time. If we're agreed to 1 hour, I just don't want to extend that a lot. But there is one maybe final question today, which is are there any possibilities where building a large language model would be a good thing? So comes to mind an example of the with the Maori data sovereignty experience and the use of LLMs in order to help maintain their language. But I was wondering if there are other
Yeah.
opportunities of that.
So the work of Tehiko Media is amazing and I think really wonderful. And the way they come at it with data sovereignty in mind is super important. I don't think they actually use the term data sovereignty, but it is very consonant with the way other people talk about data sovereignty. Um, Certainly the transformer architecture, which is the actual sort of formal device behind the large language models, has its applications. And language modeling is an important component of automatic transcription and machine translation and things like spell check. Where I will hold the line is that I think there is no beneficial use case for synthetic text. So when we take a language model, even if we could make one that was built without labor exploitation, without stolen data, without terrible environmental impacts, um, even then, using that thing to produce synthetic text that nobody's accountable for seems to me fundamentally harmful. But if you want to talk about language modeling in terms of its original use cases as components of other kinds of language technology, if you want to talk about the word embeddings that are involved in these neural language models as a way to do query expansion and search and so on, there are certainly beneficial directions to go there, provided that you have good data handling practices, good data sovereignty, good treatment of all of your workers, and so on.
okay. Thank you very much. I believe we have arrived at the end of our time, but it was great. And I invite everyone who is watching to read the book, also the other books mentioned here. The AI Con. It's possible to buy on Amazon, but I know it's possible to buy in other places. The advantage of Amazon is that you can buy with a Brazilian credit card, which I'm not sure if you can buy in other online libraries, but there are several options. If you want to, you can ask me. I have just bought also another book that I'm not sure you probably have read too, Why We Fear AI by Hagen Blix. There's also the Empire of AI, many other books that are being, I believe Victor Hugo wrote two blog posts, one about the icon and the other about AI snake oil, right? So many options for people to get informed. I also
Yeah.
suggest that people follow Emily and Alex on Blue Sky. They are very active there. And I ask for the final words from maybe Gisele, Victor,
Yeah, I
Alex,
was.
Emily.
Thank you so much for the conversation. But I would also recommend to our listeners, the Brazilian ones, especially, or everyone who speaks Portuguese around the world, to read the translation that Adolfo made of Emily's text for the UNESCO meeting last week. So that's interesting because we have many students that don't read English still here in Brazil. So I found your text and then we shared it, and Adolfo made a translation, put it in his GitHub. I think it's very, very important for everyone who is, worried about education and the AI takeover. And so, yeah, I think it was a good thing that he did. So at least we have that text of yours, Emily, translated, and that I would highly recommend
Yes,
that reading
if
too.
if any publisher, Brazilian publisher, wants to translate their book, it would be
Yeah,
great.
we would really love to have it in Portuguese so we could discuss in the classrooms and try to keep the fight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
They, I
Thank
just
you
want to say
very much.
thank you, and I hope you continue the work. And good luck. It's the book is great. It's a really great book to read. So I suggest everyone to have a look.
Thanks, Emily. Any final words?
I just want to say thank you so much for this conversation and for continuing this conversation in Brazil. And yes, any publishers who are interested in producing a Portuguese translation should please get in touch. We are definitely working on translations and getting those set up.
Great. And Alex,
No, I disagree. Thank you so much. Please stay in contact and really appreciate the time.
thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And bye bye.